As one who suffered from some of Mugabe's policies and Mugabe's actions as leader, but one who remains a committed Pan-Africanist, I thought that I should offer a disclaimer that says that I would liken this reflective on Mugabe to urge us to abstain from pathologizing Robert Gabriel Mugabe. There are those who are Mugabe mania. Mugabe was an iconic leader without parallel to them. Mugabe was infallible. He was all-knowing, an astute professional and statesman, an unassailable socialist, Marxist, and Pan-Africanist. But then there is also Mugabe phobia. Mugabe is seen as having been the arch evil, obsessive, vindictive, actuated by malice and murderous. And in thinking about this, when they reflect on Mugabe's legacy, some reflect on the legacy of struggle, that of a fighter who fought till the very end, a principled man that stood for the liberation of Black people till the very end. And yet others associate Mugabe with the legacy of pain, the murderous incursion by the army in Gukurahundi, the genocidal acts in Matabeleland in the Midlands, the post-2000 violence, post-2008 violence. And indeed, they say, they that live by the sword must end by the sword, and referring to the coup that removed Mugabe. Either judgments seem uncharitable, affectual, and perhaps subjective. But how else do you judge a leader who has ruled you for 37 years except through subjectivities with a little tinge of objectivity? There are many faces and phases to Robert Mugabe. Those who reminisce and remember him as a teacher perhaps remember him differently. Some who remember him as a Catholic, a devout, religious man, ask themselves the question, was he a good Catholic? Well, that debate can rage on for years. And then there are others who remember him as a husband, a lover, a father. And then others remember him as a guerrilla. When people yearn for a patriotic history where there was a gallant fight against imperialism and colonialism, where rhetoric and speech and morale was driven by songs, by words, by images, Mugabe strikes a figure of a good guerrilla, a fighter. Some would ask, did he actually fight? Well, whatever answer we give, we can't deny that Mugabe suffered at the hands of the Rhodesian state. Some would say, as Ibo and Faye reflected, that is the phrase IMF, which simply means it's Mugabe's fault. A person has many kids unplanned and can't pay for them. It's Mugabe's fault. One is caught stealing. It's Mugabe's fault. So as a nation, we have this default IMF acronym, which says it's Mugabe's fault. But is it really always Mugabe's fault? Well, clearly, we know that state capacity to deliver, as Faye, you've said, not only energy, electricity, healthcare, and other basic services diminished after some time, having started on a great path. We know that the pathway of developing leaders within both the ruling party and government began to suffer diminishing returns, having begun. So the one thing we all cannot deny, whatever the causes, is that Mugabe had a great start, but Mugabe did not finish strong. There is in the book Serving Secretly, a Rhodesian writer and former director of the CIO alleges that President Chisano told him that Mugabe is not a Marxist like one of us. He's not one of us. Was Mugabe Pan-Africanist? For those who suffered the brunt of the violence in Matabeleland, for those within ZANU-PF who alleged the intrigues of ethnic, ethno-regional, and tribal politics might differ. But for those that saw Mugabe send troops to the Congo, that saw him stand up for the liberation of Mozambique and others, they may hold a different view. So clearly, it is important that if we are to judge Mugabe, we place him within a historical context of the Cold War that nurtured him, the context of a racist, fascist regime in Rhodesia that imprisoned him, and the viciousness of the war that created wounds that were indelible. The grave insecurity and the ghost of the wounds and enmity and the suspicions born during the struggle for liberation, these intrigues could only have created resilient insecurity. Whether that could explain ethno-regional atrocity or explain the clientelism, the nepotism, and the tribalism, or explain the racism and the universalization of certain goods, or the insecurity, the insurgency, and dissidentry. Well, clearly, there was insecurity in the east of the country. There was dissidentry in Matabeleland. And that's quite separate from whether Kukurahundi, that atrocity was justifiable. But it is important we do not conflate two things. The country gained its independence totally uneasy. The tensions within and amongst the nationalist fighters, unbearable. The machinations of the Rhodesians to ensure that you did not have a cohesive and coherent Black government, unrelenting. The naivety of including those whose racist views were that the native has no capacity to rule and were not interested in ensuring that the government totally delivers cannot be mistaken. But we shall forever judge Mugabe on the basis that he promised, Gutsaru Shinji, that we would eat and live better than we did under Ian Smith. And at the end of the day, we had become the laughingstock of the continent. But Mugabe presided over an ideological amoeba or octopus. He presided over comrades who claimed, like him, to be Marxists, but engaged in the most vile, primitive accumulation. Mugabe dealt with Western and imperial designs against his rulership, whether it was cooptation by knighting him and making him Sir Robert, where he is accused by others of complicity, or the ostracization that followed when he decided to take a position consistent with his liberation ideals and credentials, and the naivety of thinking that he would be left alone, or whether it was the consistent attempts to eliminate him and the overall attempt to alienate him, not only in his country, but internationally. Nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and defensive radicalism that we see as a spectrum of development in his life and the contradictions that it came with can be explained both as personal character-related issues, but also as objective and subjective factors of the moment. It is true that we don't make history in the circumstances of our own choosing. We make history in the circumstances that we find ourselves. So Mugabe, who at the end we could rightly say of his party, of his life, personal life, and we could say of the country that it's no longer at ease and the center cannot hold, faced a contest over the past because patriotic history could not cure the cleavages, the gaps in capacity, the gaps in honesty and integrity, the gaps in skill, the numerous gaps that existed. And this is a lesson, Dr. Mandaza, for those who are fighting either for democracy or a vision of the future. That sheer passion and commitment, ideological erudition is insufficient to run a state. That the business of running a state takes a measure of skill, managerial competence, and leadership commitment. So when we judge the legacy of Mugabe, we must center not purely on political leadership, but on statecraft and state leadership. But we must commend him for having brought the professionals, because this is foresighted. But we must also castigate him for, after many years, he began to throw away the professionals and to politicize the civil service, politicize local authorities in a way that took away the capacity to deliver, the capacity to envision, the capacity to implement. But there was a contest towards the latter days, Dr. Mandasa, over state accumulation, or the state as a site of accumulation. The hollowing out of the state that we see was not only the outcome of the imperial policies of structural adjustment, it was also because the comrades had joined the imperialists in taking everything valuable out of our country, including the future of our children, and taking it to the imperial centers or to new centers in Asia and the Middle East. The leadership in the liberation movement never believed it would grow old. If it did, it never understood that young people of the generation they had liberated would, like them during their own youth, be restless, positively discontented, or simply, as some say, never underestimate the condescension of posterity. Because posterity does not see the crickets, the snake, the frogs, and the difficulties of the caves you sleep in when you fight for liberation. Posterity can only judge you on the basis of their comfort or discomfort. But there was, too, the South African effect. Mugabe presided over an island of excellence. As South Africa gets independence, South Africa takes the limelight. But South Africa also grabs industries. But South Africa does much more. It draws international capital to a new center, to a new Dali. It was not just a contest over the SADC organ between Mugabe and Mandela. There were huge contests over who is the real hegemon in the region. And in there lies a challenge that speaks to character and personality, the inability to adapt and to pivot. So how might we judge Mugabe? Avoiding the dangers of a single narrative. Well, Mugabe postponed racial injustice in exchange for power, or what he believed was amity, as indicated in his great speech issued on the 4th of March. But those of you who were alive and seized with the moment will say, only a fool can suggest that Mugabe could have taken any other path, because the brittleness of the situation in 1980, the likelihood of resilient back into war was such that he could not take reckless actions. But as I said, posterity doesn't have the comfort of the moment. It has the discomfort of its own moment. Lack of food, lack of jobs, lack of educational opportunities, and essentially an abysmal lack of futures. Mugabe holds that education and hard work was the pathway to liberation. But it is a posterity that observes children of the rich, cronies of the rich, who neither have education nor hard work, live the most lavish lifestyles, enough to gift the rest of society, milking the state. So Mugabe's legacy of education, of hard work, has been belied by those in his own party who have mistaken liberation for accumulation and conspicuous consumption and show off as the essence of being the ruling class. There is no longer Gutsaru Jinji. There is now Zimbabwe Inc. That is a legacy that Mugabe may have unintentionally left. But Mugabe felt insecure at a personal level. The entire region was being destabilized by South Africa and CIA-sponsored entities, whether it's Renamo or other juntas, or, let's be clear that despite this fact, Mugabe cannot escape the scourge of guilt that comes from Gukurahundi. Mugabe grew and shrunk the Zimbabwean economy. Those that want to refer to doomsday and Mugabe's failure dare not dispute simple figures, which were how he grew the education sector. Those who look at all his other evil qualities must remember Mugabe made Zimbabwe popular. Wherever you go, whether you're in New York or in Mali, when you say Zimbabwe, they say Mugabe. But Mugabe also made Zimbabwe infamous and the laughing stock children crossing into South Africa risking being chewed by crocodiles, and all the other debased things that our people now do. The most literate country in Africa at some time has become the one country that can't fix simple problems, because our literacy has at its core another one of Mugabe's legacies. When Mugabe arrived in Mozambique, we are told one of the first institutions he closed was the Washandi, the ideological colleges. An ideologue threatened by ideological posture. But that's not all. Mugabe, an astute, highly literate man, also has another challenge. Raises a government of thugs where anti-intellectualism became a centerpiece within his own party. But anti-intellectualism became a centerpiece of our politics. Ignorance became the driving force and was conflated and mistaken for simplicity and proximity to the masses. And yet, to run a modern economy, to make the sort of calculus or calculations that enable you to do the energy mix that you were talking about, Faye, to address the question of electricity, to address the question, you require a measure of intellectual rigor and managerial and leadership competence. So Mugabe, the astute literate man, the visionary leader, may have been a poor manager. When you look at infrastructure, water, electricity, and transport, was this the failure of imagination or the destruction of imagination? Let me explain. You see, Mugabe was not short of imagination. It is sometimes when the leader sees there must be a team to do. When you remove the team, it does not matter how much the leader sees. It is a mere vision. A vision is a combination of a wish and a vision. As they say, wishes are not donkeys, and no one can ride them. Mugabe's social spending that produced great educated folks and doctors has become the heritage of South Africa, of his neighbors, and the rest of the world. Because the poor governance and management of Zimbabwe as an economy and a country has essentially driven Mugabe's greatest heritage, which was literacy, professionalism, to others, because our own country no longer values professionalism. But Mugabe was not a system. He was a single person. We would have to be disciplined enough to say, like all of us, here was a man with grave and great weaknesses. Here is a man who caused grievous harm to us, but here is also a man whose redeeming good features perhaps may constitute the basis upon which we build our own greatness. Mugabe is no longer here. It doesn't matter how much we blame him. Those of us who are alive are observing with splendor how several years after Mugabe left power, what remains, what we thought would redeem us from what we thought was a man-made disaster by a single man, has resulted in greater darkness at noon. Isn't it ironic that Mugabe becomes hated by the white world because his party says we're taking land from white people and giving it to black people, and we will not pay compensation if Britain does not pay? And that becomes his place of death, or his place of where he nailed his political destiny. And his successors come and they do exactly the opposite. Isn't it ironic that the same Mugabe said, Blair, you can have your Britain and I'll have my Zimbabwe? Would rather have dignity in starvation than servitude in acceptance. And yet today we give everything away. Wetlands, we give away the most valuable minerals, not to create jobs, but to create uber-rich folks, criminals who hide within and behind liberation and democratic parties in order to disembowel the very futures of Zimbabweans. A ruling party without ideological compass, an opposition which may have lost its GPS signal, is a country in crisis, not just a leadership crisis, but a moral crisis, an ideological crisis, and a crisis of perception and vision. So there is an impasse, and that impasse is one up here. Being a great people means that we derive from not just Mugabe, but the generation of liberators that were with him, Joshua Mqabu, Tongogara, and others. Posterity will valorize those who died, but they were imperfect men. Men with many weaknesses, with many horrible attributes. But it is this very story that it is these imperfect men and women that brought us to this point of liberation. Their imperfections we must never hide, but their contribution we must never deny. I agreed to come here because it would be treacherous and it would be dishonest for us to simply say Mugabe can only be known for Gukurahundi. And it would be equally treacherous for us to say Gukurahundi never happened. And to start arguing about the numbers. Gukurahundi happened. And our history has these wrinkles, these blood stains, these screams and cries of pain, bones that are buried in shallow graves, people assassinated for political difference. But our history also has the moments of unity that you described. Our history has hope. I thank you for inviting me to celebrate a person who I opposed politically, but a person whose contribution to who we are as a country should not be denied purely because we differ politically. Thank you.
I'm a king, yes, I'm a king, I think I'm a king,